Throughout history, women have managed their natural cycles and have helped one another to cope with menstruation, pregnancy, pregnancy termination, miscarriage, labor, and delivery, and other aspects of reproductive life. Since the 1800s, contraception and access to abortion have been subject to laws and regulations in the U.S. History.com noted, prior to 1821, abortions were generally accessible and were often performed by midwives as well as doctors. That changed as women's reproductive rights in the United States became more contentious. An 1873 case established federal control over contraception distribution. The case was known as the Comstock Act, named for a man who had made it his mission to rid the world of anything he deemed illicit or immoral. The Comstock Act banned the mailing of contraceptives, abortion devices, and so-called obscene materials. The Comstock Act was extremely controversial and sparked a century-long backlash that ultimately led to the Roe v. Wade decision 100 years later. In the 1900s, family planning clinics were open to provide contraceptives and education, and sometimes came into conflict with Comstock. By 1960, women's access to contraception broadened with the FDA's approval of the pill. Still, proponents of reproductive choice continued to push for legal abortion. In Chicago, a group of women known as the Jane Collective took matters into their own hands. The Janes systematically, safely provided 11,000 abortions illegally between 1968 and 1973. In January 1973, the Supreme Court's landmark Roe v. Wade decision made the work of groups such as the Janes obsolete. Roe guaranteed the right to abortion in the United States. The ruling was not met with widespread protest at the time, yet Congress failed to enshrine the right in statute, which has left abortion vulnerable to attack, and abortion rights have been attacked relentlessly for decades. Since the Roe decision, anti-abortion opponents have fought to chip away at the ruling and to overturn it. This is the story of that fight and its impact on one city, Pensacola, Florida, where feminists, supporters of women's rights, and proponents of bodily autonomy and choice have consistently stood up for abortion rights and struggled against right-wing reactionaries who have often used violence in their effort to silence pro-choice advocates. Shortly after the Roe v. Wade decision, the Ladies Center opened in Pensacola and began providing legal abortions. The clinic's administrator, Linda Taggart, a registered nurse, was a fixture of the Ladies Center from the beginning. The clinic operated mostly quietly for the first 10 years. But in 1983, the nationwide anti-abortion protest movement began in Pensacola, driven by extremists who believe that violence is justified to stop abortions. On Mother's Day, 1983, a large anti-abortion rally drew 3,000 people to Seville Square. Then Pensacola Mayor Vince Wibbs declared Right to Life Day in the city. Meanwhile, protests at the Ladies Center that year were the nation's first large-scale demonstrations of the kind, dominated by fundamentalist Protestants rather than Catholics. There is no clear single reason why Pensacola became the hotbed of the abortion battle, or why the city became synonymous with violent extremism. A confluence of factors seems to have contributed, according to James Risen, co-author of the book Wrath of Angels: The American Abortion War. For one, the city's location in Northwest Florida means that it is accessible from other nearby southern states, with stricter abortion laws. Risen also credits the fundamentalist culture of the city and the presence of a man by the name of John Burt, a self-identified born-again Christian and one-time KKK member who is closely linked with the violence and death that ensued. In 1984, there were 2 bombings at the Ladies Center. In June, the clinic was damaged when an early morning bomb went off at its location near the University Mall. The Ladies Center reopened a month later on 9th Avenue. On Christmas morning of the same year, 3 bombs went off within 20 minutes of each other at the clinic and at the local offices of 2 doctors who provided abortions. 4 people were charged in the attack: Matt Goldsby, Jimmy Simmons, Kathy Simmons, and Kay Wiggins. One of them later told reporters that the bombing was, quote, a present for Jesus on his birthday. The group also claimed credit for the June bombing. According to an article in the New York Times, few people in Pensacola openly condoned the bombings, but neither was there an outpouring of condemnation. John Burt and other anti-abortionists protested the bombers' trial. Burt identified as the spiritual advisor to the bombers and later to the other men who attacked doctors at the Ladies' Center. Over the years, Burt was charged with trespassing, assault, disorderly conduct, and was linked with a thwarted bombing of the Ladies' Center. Burt ran a home in Milton for so-called troubled girls. In 2003, he was arrested for molesting a 15-year-old girl who lived there. He was sentenced to 18 years. In 2013, he died in prison. Pensacola received ongoing national attention as abortion opponents continued to target the clinic, breaking into damaged equipment and planning blockades. One 1989 article declared, "In the battle over the Ladies' Center, it's Linda Taggart versus the God Squad." On March 10, 1993, anti-abortion protester Michael Griffin killed Dr. David Gunn, an abortion provider, outside the Ladies' Center. Workers' World reports, the assassination was the first documented murder of an OBGYN specialist in the U.S., where the killer's stated intent was to prevent the doctor from performing abortions. The murder was followed by a letter published by 30 anti-abortion extremists led by right-wing reactionary Paul Jennings Hill, stating that the murder of doctors who performed abortions was justified. A Florida jury found Griffin guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. In 2017, after a parole hearing, the state ordered Griffin to remain in prison. He goes up for parole again in 2043. Community members held a candlelight vigil on the night of Gunn's murder. Recognizing that the city would again be in the spotlight, they set out to be proactive in protecting the clinic. Bill Kaplinger was the board president of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Pensacola in 1993 and began helping to organize escorts to protect women seeking an abortion. As anti-abortion protesters arrived, women's rights activists from the National Organization for Women and the Feminist Majority, along with Unitarian Universalists and other community members, quickly organized. The escorts represented the typical array of Pensacola citizens: activists, veterans, students, military spouses, and church members. Kaplinger said, "We got more clinic escorts, and that's when we went into a full clinic defense training." Some clinic escorts attempted to diffuse tensions by negotiating with moderate anti-abortion activists. A University of West Florida anthropology professor named Dallas Blanchard led these negotiation efforts. Seeing the rise of the so-called religious right, Blanchard traveled the country to interview people ranging from abortion clinic protesters to clinic staff. He wrote several books using his research on the religious right inspired by the events in Pensacola. As the country reeled in the aftermath of Gunn's murder, the popular grunge bands Pearl Jam and L7 kicked off their Rock for Choice tour in Pensacola at the Civic Center on March 9, 1994, nearly 1 year after Gunn's death. Dr. Gunn's son, David Gunn Jr., addressed the crowd from the stage toward the end of the concert, which was a fundraiser for the group The Feminist Majority. The Rock for Choice poster declares, "The right to have safe, legal abortions took many years and lives to obtain. Our freedom of choice is in danger. We won't go back." After Gunn's murder, increased protection for doctors providing abortions became paramount. Abortion rights advocates utilized nonviolent practices. They opted not to wear body armor or arm themselves out of concern for making a volatile situation worse. 2 members of the Unitarian Universalist Church, June and Jim Barrett, volunteered to transport a doctor from the airport to the clinic. June was a retired nurse who served with the Public Health Service. Jim was a retired Air Force colonel and World War II veteran. On July 29, 1994, Bill Kaplinger planned to arrive early at the clinic when he learned that there had been a shooting. In the 2000 HBO film Soldiers in the Army of God, June Barrett recounted the moment she and her husband Jim Barrett arrived at the clinic with Dr. Bayard Britton and saw anti-abortion protester Paul Hill standing at the entrance. Hill was the same man who had written after the killing of Dr. Gunn that murdering abortion providers is justified. As Jim Barrett parked at the Ladies' Center, Paul Hill approached his truck, pulled out a shotgun, and fired 3 times, killing Jim Barrett. June Barrett fell to the floor of the truck. She was wounded but survived. Hill reloaded and shot and killed Dr. Britton. Although the doctor was wearing a bulletproof vest, his head was unprotected. Hill was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 2003. In his last words, he showed no remorse for the murders. Kaplinger spent the next 18 years helping to organize clinic defense, until 2012 when another anti-abortion terrorist, Bobby Joe Rogers, firebombed the Ladies' Center. The clinic burned down. Rogers received 10 years in prison. After the arson, the clinic was renamed American Family Planning and continued to provide legal abortion services in Pensacola. Because of COVID-19, American Family Planning was closed for most of 2020. When the clinic reopened in December, anti-abortion protesters resumed demonstrating outside and taunting patients and staff in the parking lot. Reproductive justice advocates returned to defend the clinic. One of the most stalwart clinic defenders was the sister of Michael Griffin, who killed Dr. Gunn. She recognizes the dangers wrought by anti-abortion terrorists. As protests at the clinic amplified in 2020, nearby businesses became concerned. In April 2021, a no trespass order went into effect after all the business owners signed on. Anti-abortion protesters could no longer stand anywhere around the clinic. Clinic supporters, however, understood that the fight for abortion access would not end there. Throughout 2021, as in earlier years, legislators introduced a variety of anti-abortion bills. Activist Ashley Faulkner told In Weekly, "There's always another bill. There's always another attack on women's bodies." In May 2022, Florida's Agency for Healthcare Administration ordered the American Family Planning Clinic to close after 3 women who had been treated there were hospitalized over a period of 8 months. The clinic never reopened. For a person in the Pensacola area seeking abortion services, Tallahassee is now the nearest clinic location. Also in May 2022, a draft was leaked of a Supreme Court majority decision that would overturn the right to an abortion. Protests in defense of Roe v. Wade erupted across the country, including Pensacola. The decision in the case Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization was officially delivered by the court in June 2022, about 50 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. The ruling overturned the protections guaranteed by Roe. The Dobbs decision means that the abortion issue is now fully in the hands of each state to determine. In many states, earlier trigger laws went into effect, banning abortion or restricting it at varying points in pregnancy. The Guardian reports, all of this tumult has led to a deeply uneven abortion landscape with access to abortion clinics cut off across much of the South and Midwest, but standing strong on both coasts. Faced with further erosion of abortion rights, voters in several states have turned out en masse to block abortion bans, including Wyoming, Montana, Iowa, and Wisconsin. In August 2023, Linda Taggart died. For 5 decades, Taggart has been at the center of Pensacola's abortion battle. She had experienced bombings, shootings, invasions of the clinic, assaults, and death threats on her life and her daughter's life. Taggart's obituary read in part, Linda Taggart was a trailblazer. Her profession led her down paths that not all nurses would have taken, but she had a fierce and loyal compassion to do the right thing, even if she sometimes put herself in harm's way. She moved up the ranks of her profession and was honored and sought out for her opinions and leadership. She was an advocate for human rights in all aspects of her life, and the world was a better place because of it. Over the course of 2023, Florida reproductive justice advocates collected nearly 1 million signatures in a citizen-led initiative known as the Amendment to Limit Government Interference with Abortion. The goal is to codify the right to reproductive health care into Florida law by creating a constitutional amendment that explicitly blocks the implementation of laws that prohibit, delay, or restrict abortion access. Petitions collected exceeded the number required for the amendment to be included on the 2024 ballot as Amendment 4. Like always, Pensacola community members played a key role in this struggle for abortion rights. Members of the Unitarian Universalist Church circulated petitions in support of the amendment, along with members of a new organization, Pensacola Abortion Rights Task Force, or PART, which is comprised of people from a variety of organizations. Even as stalwart reproductive justice advocates struggle to preserve access to reproductive health care, religious extremists and Christian nationalists continue to force their interpretation onto all Americans. The Alabama Supreme Court's recent ruling on legal personhood for frozen embryos has cast a spotlight on the concept of fetal personhood, which all along has been the endgame of the anti-abortion activists. The concept of fetal personhood involves the declaration that life begins at the moment that an egg is fertilized by a sperm, and the granting of full rights to embryos from the moment of conception. The bodily autonomy of pregnant persons, or persons who could become pregnant, is a cornerstone of human rights. But these rights have been perpetually under attack, and our ancestors and peers have sacrificed life and limb in pursuit of them. The overwhelming majority of Floridians think we should all have the freedom to make our own personal health care decisions without interference from politicians. However, in the words of the activist Frederick Douglass, who was an avowed supporter of women's rights, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. We in Pensacola unceasingly demand and organize for safe, legal abortion, contraception, healthcare, and reproductive justice. Which side are you on?
Who dares to take our rights away? You must not know the way she prays. She offers her own word and stays at the center of the room. Her body moves her with the moon. No man could know her inner truth. She feels the wisdom of her womb, and alone can feel its pain. Who dares to take her rights away? God unleash her power as we pray that those who love her will be saved, while cleansing fire consumes defective robots that forgot over programmed with misled thoughts that calibrate your loving shots. She is the one to choose. Who dares to take her rights away? God unleash her power as we pray that those who loved her will be saved. The protector of the womb.